we've seen obviously a lot of activity in cyberspace from advanced actors turning towards the destructive end of things. Not anything necessarily new, but are you seeing an increase? What can you share in terms of that perspective?
Yeah. So there are a variety of actors that have decided to be more destructive than maybe financially motivated or espionage motivated. And so we see that from both a criminal perspective as well as from a nation state perspective. The criminals, they tend to be destructive because they are financially motivated and they're hoping that if they could create as much chaos as possible, that might coerce a victim into paying an extortion demand. From a nation state perspective, we tend to find that some nation states aren't interested in stealing data, but they're more interested in causing some kind of havoc against a victim organization or a country that may have spoken negatively about another country. So to give you a few examples, there's an allegation against athletes in Russia that were using performance enhancement drugs around the 2016 timeframe. And so what we saw in retaliation was we saw Russian nexus groups hack into anti-doping agencies in the United States and the rest of the world. And they conducted a very disruptive operation that disrupted their operations for those organizations, but also they stole data, they published that data that they stole, they doctored some of that data. And so it's more of a destructive and retaliatory type of attack by some adversaries that's been going on for some time. And of course, over the past few years, we've seen a very intense level of attacks by Russia against Ukraine. We saw a destructive attack against a satellite communications organization that coincided with the physical invasion in Ukraine. And since then, we've seen a variety of other attacks that have disrupted business operations or the distribution of power in the region as Russia continues to conduct both cyber and physical attacks against the country.
Are these groups kind of testing the waters with some of these attacks in terms of geopolitics driving offensive security, for example? I mean, how disturbed should we be about this trend?
So there's always going to be a tie between geopolitical tensions and offensive security operations by nation states. And so there's a few things that are on our minds right now. Number one, we've been seeing this play out for quite some time, is the attacks by Russia against Ukraine. We saw that in 2015, we saw that in 2016, and we saw it at a much larger scale in 2017 with NotPetya. But as I mentioned before, there's a lot of tie-ins with cyber attacks that are coinciding with physical attacks. We saw a physical attack against an energy organization in Ukraine 2 years ago that coincided with the missile launch against that part of Ukraine. And so we'll probably continue to see things like that in that part of the world. As you look at what's going on in the Middle East right now, we see a lot of hacktivist activity by a variety of actors, both hacktivist groups, non-affiliated folks, but also nation states. And right now in the United States, everybody's thinking about the potential invasion of Taiwan by China. And what does that do to national security in the United States and the Western world? And so as we see intrusions against utility companies and critical infrastructure organizations and defense contractors in the United States, we're pretty concerned with at what point in time will these China nexus intrusions start to turn into something more destructive?
Are there red lines in cyberspace? I mean, it doesn't seem to be, and I'm just curious, like, how concerned you are about this kind of lack of a...
Yeah, so I think there are industry and government accepted red lines as it relates to nation state intrusions. So I think there's some ambiguity, but I think there's generally accepted red lines that exist today. And so I think everybody kind of understands that a potential cyber attack against certain countries, particularly NATO members, might be perceived as an act of war, which could result in a military response. So from a nation-state perspective, I feel like it's somewhat understood and somewhat accepted. Where it's not really defined and where it's not accepted is, from a criminal perspective, we see a lot of threat actors that don't seem to have any boundaries that will go really far and cause a certain level of destruction and chaos that's just not really fair, that has a outsized impact on the victim organizations.
Yeah, I mean, we saw some of that during COVID with attacking the hospitals, for example, and the ransomware. And that problem kind of continues to run unabated, unfortunately.
We are seeing an increased volume of attacks against healthcare organizations right now, just because these threat actors realize that healthcare organizations have a lot of reasons to pay threat actors. And unfortunately, these healthcare organizations just feel compelled and feel like they have no other option but to pay to try to resume business operations and try to protect patient data as best as they can.
Mm-hmm. What are you seeing specifically about Sandworm and their operations in Ukraine? I mean, there's some of this activity has been made public, but obviously there's more going on that's classified.
I mean, Sandworm is the group that we all pay attention to because they're the one that has demonstrated not only a capability, but a willingness to actually conduct cyber attacks that have led to physical outcomes. We've seen the power go out in Ukraine multiple times. We've seen NotPetya significantly impact organizations in Ukraine, but also the rest of the world. So Sandworm is just one of those groups that we're going to continue to keep an eye out for because they not only have the capability, but they have the willingness. And I point that out because there are other groups, there are other nations that have the capability to do something very destructive, but they haven't shown the willingness to do it. And to give you maybe examples, when we see China Nexus groups breaking into organizations, I know they have the capability to do significant harm. We haven't seen them do it. They seem to follow very strict rules of engagement, but that certainly could change as geopolitical tensions rise, as potentially China invades Taiwan. And again, we're keeping an eye on it.
Just one more question about Sandworm. They seem to especially be targeting operational technology, industrial control systems.
Yeah.
There's a bit of homework involved there in terms of attacking these systems. Can you kind of speak to the complexity involved there?
Yeah. So disrupting OT systems in a very basic way can be done by a lot of threat actors, by just not even doing that much research, by running an Nmap scan in a very aggressive mode against certain systems can knock it over. But what we've seen is that Sandworm and some other nation-state adversaries have really studied the OT systems. They understand the protocols, and they understand how to actually do things by leveraging the protocols or abusing the protocols. And so we've seen concerted effort to focus on OT systems. In fact, a few years ago, we saw a deliberate attack against a set of safety control systems in the Middle East, where a Russia Nexus adversary essentially tricked a safety control system into believing that safe conditions were always present, irrespective of whether or not a safe condition was actually present. And so when we see the research, when we see the willingness to actually do something that could cause physical harm, again, we pay a lot of attention to it.
Right. So similar line of questioning about Volt Typhoon, the APT linked to China. A lot of attention was thrown on the fact that some of their tools were found embedded on critical infrastructure networks, military networks, et cetera. This is a fairly drastic change in charter for them, right?
Yeah. Volt Typhoon is one of the more capable espionage, or rather, one of the more capable adversaries that's out there. And we've seen some level of espionage from them. When we look at some of the targeting is very clear to us. Why would they go after a defense contractor? It's obvious. Why would they go after maybe a telecommunications organization or technology company? It's obvious. Where I sometimes struggle is why do some China Nexus espionage groups go after random water utility companies in a small town that I've never heard about? Is there a strategic reason for that? Maybe. But let me tell you what I've actually seen happen. I've seen compromised systems in these utility companies. I've seen compromised systems in a variety of companies and in organizations. I'm not yet seeing anything destructive by China Nexus groups. But the big fear, again, is what changes if there's increasing geopolitical tensions or if there's an invasion of Taiwan.
Yeah, so that was kind of leading into my next question. Just all of this activity, how much of it is about sowing chaos among the public, stoking some fear versus actually being destructive, at least right now.
There's no question that some of these attacks are meant to create a psychological impact on people. So some of the hack and leak operations that have occurred over the past few years, particularly related to the elections, 2016 is a great example where I think there's just some willingness by certain countries to create, to sow discord amongst people, to get people to, kind of conflict with each other. And we do see some of those intrusions play out, and we've seen them happen over the years.
I'm curious, what was your reaction to the PRC's claims that Volt Typhoon was just American misinformation, disinformation?
Yeah, look, China will never acknowledge that they hack into organizations. And in fact, if we think back to the 2015 agreement between President Obama and President Xi, they got together and they said, that they don't acknowledge that there's any hacking of organizations in each other's countries, but they said in the future we're not going to hack into companies in the respective countries for economic espionage purposes. So essentially what that meant is that everything else, any other motivation for hacking, is fair game. So for defensive purposes or for political purposes, it's fair game. And what we've seen over the years is the constant denial of hacking organizations by the Chinese government. And in a way that's kind of a joke for a lot of us in the security community. And the denial is the clear admittance that they're actually doing it.
Right. Okay, so last question. There are a lot of CISOs here at Nexus, a lot of security leaders, especially among the critical infrastructure sectors. Any advice to them in terms of managing risk related to these types of actors? What can they be doing proactively?
Yeah, I mean, really two things. Number one, do what you can to share information with your peers. Share the learnings that you've maybe painfully learned over the past few months and past few years, particularly if you've dealt with a security incident. Because when you deal with a security incident, you learned about a lot of controls that have failed, and those are probably similar controls that will fail at another organization. So share what you can with them and try not to be embarrassed by it. And also equally, when you learn from others, don't make them feel bad and alienate them for dealing with a security event. And the second thing is engage offensive security folks to try whatever they can to break into the organization. Define a number of objectives, test large parts of the environment, try lots of creative things that adversaries would actually do to break into an organization. And don't feel bad if your testers break in. Just use it as an opportunity to increase your network visibility, improve processes, train your team, and just get better and better and better over time.